Hi, I'm Konrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we speak to Kate Winslet. The Oscar-winning actress is in Australia right now, promoting her new film, Lee, a biopic about the life of pioneering war correspondent Lee Miller. Miller's photography from the front lines of the Second World War famously captured the most telling and sensitive micro-details within that setting, in a way that perhaps only a woman could. Her images take viewers into the London Blitz, the liberation of Paris, and the atrocities of Nazi concentration camps in Buchenwald and Dachau. Winslet is, of course, the star of films and TV shows, from Titanic to Mayor of Easttown, and she joins me today from a hotel room in Sydney. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. First off, I just wanted to confirm something. I believe you have Lee Miller's kitchen table in your home. How did that happen?
I have, yes, I do. I have a table that was owned in the Penrose holiday home. And when Lee Miller and Roland Penrose were newly lovers, they would spend a great deal of time in this home. And Lee was an incredible cook. And that was the kitchen table. And she would cook the food and they would eat the food and they would have these wonderful sort of hedonistic summers of love with their surrealist friends all around them. And yeah, some friends of mine work for an auction house and the table came in and they called me and they said, Kate, you've got to get this table, and told me the story behind it. And I just couldn't believe it. And so I did get the table, and that was back in 2015. And that was the beginning of the whole journey for me. I just sat at this table and I thought, wow, Lee Miller sat at this table too. Why hasn't anyone made a film about her? And that was really the beginning for me.
Fantastic. I have to admit, I was largely ignorant of Lee Miller before seeing your film. I know there was a book, The Lives of Lee Miller, which was published in 1999, almost a quarter of a century ago. But there's a little bit more cut through with movies often. It made me think of watching Hidden Figures, that movie about a group of female African-American mathematicians who work with NASA on the space program. I was wondering, what is it that you think makes movies such a great vehicle for recognition or celebration of underappreciated figures?
It's such a brilliant thing to talk about. It really is. I mean, with movie making, even extraordinary television, I'm a huge fan of being part of episodic television for these wonderful streamers now as well. But you do have the power to not just entertain people, but to sometimes educate them on who it was who really did that extraordinary thing that you may or may not necessarily know about. But even discovering somebody, perhaps for the first time, like maybe it sounds like you have done with Lee Miller, but discovering them for who they really were. And what I found in putting the film together and the 5 years I spent developing it before we even had a movie that was ready to go, I learned that so many women of historical significance were often defined through the male gaze, or they had these labels slapped on them. Lee Miller was known for having been this former cover girl, ex-lover and muse of Man Ray. That term muse, it's very reductive in a way, almost infantilizing. And Lee was a model for a tiny sliver of her life in her 20s, and she hated being a model. She couldn't wait to walk away from it, and very famously said, I'd rather take a picture than be one. She'd always loved photography. She'd learnt it from her father as a child. It was something she'd always done, was very comfortable with a camera. And that was what she wanted to do with her life. And having the courage that she had to go to war as a woman, to get the right to go, to get those permissions was incredibly tough. No women were being allowed into those conflict zones, but Lee just wouldn't take no for an answer. And this decade of her life that we cover in the film, for me, was when Lee really became Lee. She went to war as a flawed, complicated, middle-aged woman, and she did it to bear witness, to be that visual voice for the innocent victims of conflict. And when you think about photojournalism today and what those individuals do to capture those searing, arresting, sometimes terrifying images, it is the most phenomenally selfless and brave job in order to reveal the truth to those of us at home who have no idea what's going on. And Lee was one of those pioneering people who did that as a woman. And it was just a story that I just felt it really had to be told.
It happened so slowly, yet kind of overnight.
We woke up one morning and Europe was at war.
Only non-military access for women.
I just want to do my part. Why should the men get to decide what that is?
I'm heading to the front. Ready to go?
That's not what I thought you were going to say.
Watching this film in this moment, it's impossible for, at least where I sit, not to reflect on the journalists that have been killed in the past year during the Israel-Gaza war. Recent reports suggest something like 128 media workers have died, the vast majority of them Palestinian. And that doesn't seem to have created that much of a stir at all. Does that surprise you in this day and age?
So many things surprise me in this day and age. You know, when I was putting Lee Miller together, I was very, very fortunate to have a former female photojournalist who now covers security for Reuters and who shall remain nameless out of respect for her. She helped me enormously in coming to understand what that job is like for a woman now, today. And the sheer determination to bear witness and never look away took my breath away and still does. And that's why I wanted to play this role, because Lee's ability to go out into the world against all odds and do something, to make a difference, to tell those stories, to make sure that the victims of conflict stories were upheld and told and never forgotten. And to do that at a time when there was no safety, there was no run for cover, there was no get out of jail free card. And she carried on going. She didn't go home. She didn't say, this is too much. She stayed and she saw it all through. And what she did was just extraordinary and admirable. And I bow down to anyone who does that job.
There are so many moments in the film that you highlight how Miller bumped directly kind of up against the patriarchy and punched on through to do what she wanted and needed to do. I'm just wondering, when you're finished with a role like this, do you emerge with a little bit of that same sort of chutzpah that she had? Do you take a little bit of that with you into your life after you've sort of been that character for a while?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you do. And because the film was developed over a number of years, I was in a position where I had full and complete access to the archive, which exists in the UK. And it's an internationally renowned art archive run by members of Lee's family, her granddaughter Amy and her son Anthony Penrose, who was a very important collaborator for me in putting the film together. But because I had that level of access and that level of trust, I was able to be so immersed in not just her photographs, but in her life, personal diaries, letters between her and Roland, extensive letters between her and Audrey Withers, which really gave me access to a side of her that I wouldn't have otherwise had, that very female relationship that she had with Audrey that was quite unusual of the time. And she stayed very close friends with Audrey Withers until Lee passed away in 1977.
Audrey Withers being the editor of Vogue.
Exactly. Audrey Withers being the editor at the time of British Vogue. And Audrey Withers, played by Andrea Riseborough so brilliantly in our film, she was an extraordinary woman because she actually had wanted to be a writer. She was a very left-leaning individual, and she really championed other women. And Lee had never really written before. And going and being a photographer in the way that she was, that was one thing. But then having to really dig in and write about what she was witnessing was quite another thing. And Lee was really nervous of that. She didn't know if she was going to be capable of doing it at all. And in the letters between Lee and Audrey, Lee so often says to her, "Come on, dear girl, you can do it. We're cheering for you back home. You've got it in you. Just keep going." And then Lee would write back to her and say, "Oh, thank you so much. And by the way, would you mind just sending me a tin of Ovaltine, some new earplugs, and possibly a couple of spare pairs of pantyhose because I've got runners all through mine." And then Audrey would send her these amazing care packages. And so it was really all there. And so, yeah, loads of it stayed with me. The essence of who Lee Miller was, this incredibly inspiring woman, and how she lived her life with just integrity and compassion and power and resilience. You know, I try and live my life by that, and my sisters do, and my friends do. And it just reinforced for me the importance of that, especially, I think, in the world we live in today and how we want to raise our daughters. And yeah, so a lot of who Lee was has definitely stayed with me.
I've read about the amount of time that you spent going through those archives, that they sort of expected you to turn up and read through some material for a little while and then leave, but you were a constant visitor, sort of burrowing in to learn by osmosis. You also said at some point that you felt it was maybe the most traumatic role that you'd ever had, that it left an imprint on you. Was that to do with what we now assume was her depression and PTSD and struggles with alcohol after the war? What was the tough part?
It was all tough. It was all tough. Putting the film together, putting the financing together, putting the crew together, the cast, all of it. It was absolutely wonderful, but every single part of it was absolutely tough. But as an actor and now filmmaker, in having produced the film as well, you know, sometimes when you're recreating scenes of a historical nature that you absolutely know happened, and you're trying to do that in the most authentic way you possibly can, whilst you know that what you're doing isn't real, you absolutely know that it was real. Right. And the responsibility that comes with that is enormous, and especially when you have family members who are still alive and for whom this story is incredibly important and means so much to Anthony Penrose, Lee's son, that the film has now been made. I tried to make it for, it's now 9 years, and wow. And Anthony had been waiting something like 35 years to see this film get made, and many people had tried before and hadn't done it. So when you're recreating scenes entering Dachau concentration camp, discovering the train carriages, and also working through Lee's very traumatic childhood, where something horrific had happened to her, a deeply buried secret that she was told never to tell, like so many women. She refused to allow that thing to define who she was, but it did give her this very powerful streak of injustice that literally vibrated inside her, I feel, throughout her entire adult life. So recreating that level of intensity and trauma and truth, yeah, it's really, you know, it is very difficult but you have to do it. If you want people to believe what it is that you're doing, you have to do it. And it just mattered to me to do the best job I possibly could and to honour who she was for her son, Anthony Penrose's sake. If for no other reason other than that, actually, it was very important to me that he was happy.
It did have a very truthful and sort of unvarnished feel. There's a distinct kind of lack of vanity in the project. Many people have noted how there was very little makeup, no body shame. And I've heard people try to tell you before that it was sort of brave for all of this. Yet what I think you actually felt was sort of relief at being able to portray someone as they are. Is that closer to the mark?
Honestly, I don't feel like I was making any statements at all. I was just doing my job, which is what I always try and do. But it's so interesting, isn't it, how, you know, when we talk about like whether an actress has makeup on or they don't have makeup on, you know, we don't say to male actors, wow, you were so brave for this. You grew a beard.
Yeah.
You had a paunch. Well Absolutely. Done, you're brave. Wow, so brave. We don't say that to the men. Why the heck do we say it to the women? It drives me completely nuts. I was being like Lee, you know, I was trying to be as free with myself as comfortable with myself as she was with herself. And just trying to honor who she was and what she lived through.
I've heard that you've always been interested in photography, and for the film you actually learned how to use the Rolleiflex camera, just as Lee Miller had used. For listeners, that's one of those old-timey cameras you sort of hold at the level of the waist or the stomach and kind of look down at the lens plate. Did you take actual photos with it? Do you still? Do you tool around with photography?
I very much did learn how to use the Rolleiflex camera. And actually, I worked with a camera historian who built our replica camera for the film, and Anthony Penrose. Together, the three of us, they really taught me how to use it. Tony Penrose himself knows how to use that camera just like his mother did. In fact, he took it traveling with him after the war. He took that camera. He was like, this is a mighty fine camera. Off I go. It was very important that the camera didn't feel like a prop in my hands and didn't look like a prop. It had to feel like an extension of my arms. It had to be present and both disappear at the same time. So when I was winding on the film, I needed to not be looking at it. I needed to know how to use the light meter and pull focus and all of those good things and change the film, which is a very complicated thing to do. I was the only person on set actually who knew how to change the film on our camera. So it meant that during takes, if I would run out of film, there's only 12 frames on one of those rolls of film, I would just change the roll of film as we were shooting. And yes, I was really photographing every image that we are recreating of Lee Miller's own images. And a lot of my images are actually in the film, which I was incredibly proud of, because I just had to get really good at it. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I had to get really good at using that camera.
Do you have any Lee Miller photographic prints up around your house? I'm just curious to know if there was like some image or not that really struck you that you had to have, and where does it hang?
I do have one, actually. I do have one, and it's relatively big. It's probably from my head to my waist, and it was given to me by the friend who sold me the table, and she gave it to me when I finished filming. She said, "Look, you just got to have one. It's very beautifully framed, and it's an image of Lee." Literally, she looks like an unmade bed. She looks just amazing. And she's got her arms folded like this. And she's wearing her US, her fatigues, her war correspondent fatigues. She's leaning back against a wall with a row of jerry cans either side of her legs. And it's one of my favorite images of her ever taken. And so that's one that I do have in a frame. And it's just on a wall, no particular prominent place, but it's just there.
Brilliant. Speaking of the lens, there's a line from early in the film. You mentioned it earlier. I'd rather take a picture than be one. I'm just wondering, how do you feel about that as an actor, as someone who sort of is a moving picture a lot of the time?
It's so funny because I sort of see myself as a storyteller, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's why things like, these terms like, oh, it was brave and not wearing makeup and, all of these kinds of things, they kind of like don't really hit the sides. I'm like, well, I'm just telling a story. I love my job. I love acting. I really do love it. And actually, as I get older, I find myself loving it all the more. I just really value it and feel grateful for it. Grateful that I'm still being invited back to the party. It's a pretty good feeling. And there seems to be a sort of an upswell, I think, in strong roles for women in a way that is quite new and hopefully is here to stay. And making films like Lee, I feel it does contribute to that intention and that sort of movement in a way. So no, I feel it's an exciting time, I think, to be part of this industry, and it's an exciting time to be a woman getting older in this industry. I feel more in myself and I feel proud of myself. I think that's something that women are very uncomfortable saying for some reason. But I think I think it's important to say it. I think it's important to encourage one another and to say, yeah, I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of what you did. It's I think it matters a great deal. So that's sort of the time in my life I'm at right now.
You do, of course, have a big role, particularly with this film, behind the camera. You're a co-producer on the film. Is it true that you insisted that it have a female director?
Yeah, it just didn't make sense to have a male director. When it came to the point of putting the film together and because I had lived with the material by myself alongside Anthony Penrose for about 5 years, even before Kate Solomon, my co-producer, came on board. And that was when we really started to go, okay, now we've got a movie. When we thought about directors, it just somehow didn't sit right that building such a female story. I always say this is a film about a woman. It's not a film about a war. And it mattered very much that we really hung on to that intention across everything. So yes, the director being a woman, Ellen Kuras, who I've known since Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. She was a cinematographer for years, much revered cinematographer. But we had lots of department heads who were women as well, and that just mattered a great deal. And because I've been doing this job for such a long time, very, very fortunate to have had people who I've known since I was, 20 years old, working on films years and years ago. Gemma Jackson, our set designer, I have done a couple of films with over the years. And Ivana Primorak, our hair and makeup designer, I've known since 2008 when I did The Reader. And just being able to pick up the phone and say, I've got this film and, if it happens, it would mean the world if you'd come along. And they all did, And the same with the actors. I was able to make that personal outreach to everybody and they all said yes. And they stayed with us. Sometimes with an independent film, other things get in the way, other opportunities might come along for that actor and time frames shift and what have you. But everyone kept the space for us and showed up. And it's been an incredibly rewarding experience because of all of those wonderful people.
It's so interesting that you say that about it not being a war movie, but a movie about a woman, because I had no real knowledge of the movie when I went in to see the advanced screening with my wife, and I emerged later and was like, I wasn't expecting a Holocaust movie. And she sort of turned to me and snapped. She was like, it wasn't just a Holocaust movie. This was a movie about a badass bitch. Like, that was her immediate response. So
yeah, good for her.
I understand that it was you who personally asked Andy Samberg to take on a very important role in the film as well. And I think most people would know Samberg from SNL skits and goofball comedies. We love him in my house as Detective Jake Peralta from Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Yeah.
What did you best know him from, and how on earth did you see past his kind of goofy smile to make this leap of logic with the casting?
So having worked with Jack Black and Seth Rogen in my life, I know, and Jim Carrey, I know that comedians are among some of the most interesting, deep thinking people in this industry. And so I was immediately able to see past Andy's comedic brilliance. I best knew him actually from SNL and have always admired him. Loved The Lonely Island in our house as well. But here's the truth. Marion Hume, one of our co-writers, a woman who I happen to have known since I was 16 years old. She was editor of Australian Vogue for 10 years, but she started her career as fashion editor of the independent newspaper in England. Anyway, Marion, about 4 years into the process, called me up one day and she went, Winslet, have you noticed how much like Davy Sherman Andy Samberg looks? I said, does he really? She said, yeah, come on, pull up the two images now. So I did. And it was absolutely uncanny. Andy Samberg is a dead ringer for the real Davy Sherman. And she said, go on, ring him up. I said, I don't know him. She said, oh, come on. I'm sure you can get a number for this. Get in touch with him and ask him. I said, well, I don't know if he'd want to do it. He might not feel comfortable playing that kind of a role, playing somebody not comedic. But the truth is, the real Davy Sherman had the most extraordinary twinkle. He and Lee would, you know, the banter between the two of them, the fun jibing and the jokes he would crack. He was the wise guy all the time. So there was that sort of sparkle that he had that Andy clearly has in abundance. And when I first spoke to him, the thing he said straight away was, I really would love to do this. And I completely believed him. And then I said, well, do you want to just read some scenes and see how you feel? He was like, yeah, sure, I absolutely would. And it was just magic right away. There was not a hint of that. There was not a hint of SNL or Brooklyn Nine-Nine in any of it. And he was incredible at really, really communicating. He would say, what did you think of that? And how do you think I should try this next time? And just as actors do all the time, we all do that all of the time. And he was just wonderful. And I would often say to him, do less with your face. Just try one where you do less with your face. Because as a comedian, of course, their face is absolutely everything. You know, they raise an eyebrow and it can be hilariously funny. And he knows how to play an audience better than anyone I know. But so sort of removing that from himself was literally taking away his safety net. And I think it was very nerve-wracking for him. He was absolutely brilliant. And we got on so well. And he's a great friend. And I'm enormously grateful that he wanted to do this with us. He's just brilliant in the film.
One last question. This last part isn't really in the film, but I understand it's a nice coda worth knowing that Lee Miller somewhat pulled herself together before her passing, overcoming some of her troubles, taking herself away to Le Cordon Bleu cooking school and in Paris, and almost reinventing herself with this new creative outlet. As a finishing note, if Kate Winslet had a third act and had to go away and reinvent herself later on, what might that look like? What would you try your hand at?
Many different things. It would probably involve food in some way, I have to say, because I am a cook myself and love food, and we do in my family. Probably something to do with food. I don't know if I can ever really see myself truly stepping away from the film world and storytelling. I just love it so much. I've definitely done a lot more writing, been much more involved in the writing side of things for the last probably 5 years, not just with Lee, across other things. I've worked with some great writers who've really included me. Even Mayor of Easttown, I was quite included alongside Brad Inglesby in the sort of evolving shape of that character. So I don't know if I'd ever really be able to fully walk away from the creative and do something totally different. But if I did, it probably would have something to do with food. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Kate.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you. Thanks.
That was Academy Award winner Kate Winslet on another great episode of Good Weekend Talks. Tune in every week for more compelling conversations. Coming soon, we chat with the badass star of Alone Australia, Gina Chick. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Subscriptions power our newsrooms. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Technical assistance from Cormac Lally. Editing from Konrad Marshall. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.